Grant, we are ready when you're ready. Go for it.
World War I, the Central Powers versus the Allied Powers. World War II, the Axis powers versus the Allies. The Revolutionary War, the war that gave birth to this great nation, the United States. Even the Vietnam War, perhaps the most controversial war in the United States history. All these wars are probably very familiar to all of you, but the one war, the Korean War, also known as the Forgotten War, is something you probably don't know much about. So that you do not forget about this war, I'm going to inform you on the basics of the hostilities. Through various research from 5 different sources, including 3 from the Kansas State Library itself, and a solid 2 months of research last year, I have provided myself with meticulous fact-checking to provide you with the most credible synopsis of the Korean War you have ever heard. First, I'm going to tell you about North Korea's invasion into South Korea. Then I'm going to inform you about the United Nations intervention. And finally, I'm going to tell you about China's intervention in the war and the stalemate that eventually prevailed. The Korean War between the United Nations and the Communists lasted 3 long years and was comprised of 3 major stages. The Korean War began with North Korea's invasion into South Korea. The Britannica academic article, Korean War, states, North Korea invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950. Leading up to the war, Kim Il-sung, that is, the leader of Communist North Korea, had asked Joseph Stalin, the leader of Soviet Russia, for substantial aid in munitions and arms. After thinking about this proposition for a while, Joseph Stalin eventually complied, making North Korea a mechanical power and thus enabling them to have a very effective invasion of South Korea. The South Koreans were pushed to the southernmost tips of the Korean Peninsula when President Harry S. Truman asked the United Nations to come to the aid of South Korea. The UN called for the invasion to halt June 25th, then for the UN member states to provide military assistance to the ROC on June 27th, as the Britannica academic implies. South Korea was in a desperate position and in need of immediate assistance. The United Nations came to the aid of South Korea in the form of the United States. A host of problems defied a landing there. Wide tidal variance, mines, a crazy quilt of islands and shoal waters, and dangerous proximity to KPA reinforcements from Seoul. I just explained to you a host of the problems facing General Douglas MacArthur when he provided his brilliant Incheon landing on the eastern coast of Korea. This landing, not only one of the most brilliant landings in military history, it also provided the United Nations a sweep into North Korea, and they were able to come in from the north and retake Seoul, the capital of South Korea. General Douglas MacArthur, after this attack, declared South Korea liberated. The next step for the UN forces and General MacArthur was sweeping into North Korea and uniting all of Korea under one free democratic government. However, the Chinese had warned if the United Nations crossed the 38th parallel, they would indeed intervene in the war. In a statement from the Joint Chiefs of Staff to General Douglas MacArthur, the issue of limited war in Korea Joint Chiefs of Staff to General MacArthur states, and if thereafter the Chinese Communists mass large forces against your positions with an evident capability of forcing us out of Korea, it would then be necessary under these conditions to direct you to commence a withdrawal to Japan. This excerpt shows that General MacArthur had basically free reign in Korea, but if China did enter into the war, then he was to withdraw his forces back to South Korea. MacArthur and the United Nations made it all the way to the Yalu River, that is, the border between China and North Korea, before China flung its full force into the attack and made it a game changer out of the war. As the United Nations approached the Chinese border, a sleeping giant was stirring. China's intervention in the war caused an eventual stalemate at the 38th parallel, in which the war eventually ended. Dong Il Kim, authors of China's Intervention in the Korean War Revisited, states that they reached a unanimous decision on the grounds that if China dispatched troops and established 2 or 3 defensive lines, then not only U.S. but also ROC troops would stop their advance northward on the spot. This is the reasoning China took on their intervention into the war, because they knew that if at any sign of Chinese interference, the United States and United Nations would crumble. The Britannica academic states that the Korean War was a stalemate along the 38th parallel for the remainder of the war until 1953, the ending of the war, when the 2 sides agreed to leave North and South Korea separate. The Korean Peninsula would continue to be caught in the coils of Cold War rivalry, but the survival of the Republic of Korea kept alive the hope of civil liberties, democracy, economic development, and eventual unification. The Korean War lasted 3 long years in all. From the Norse invasion to China's intervention, the conflict seems to have been forgotten over the years. In the words of Melinda Pash, an interview, Melinda Pash, why is the Korea the forgotten war? Americans did not so much forget about the Korean War as never think about it at all. The war went somewhat under the radar after it did not end quickly in 1950, and the American people just kind of threw it out the side and decided not to think about it. First, I told you about North Korea's invasion into South Korea. Then I told you about the United Nations pushback and an eventual stalemate at the 38th parallel, where the war ended after China's intervention. 3 years and 2.5 million casualties, as the Britannica academic states, are statistics that contradict the tag of the Korean War as the forgotten war. The Korean War is necessary to be remembered because of its valuable aspects in preventing the spread of communism across the globe. Rather than calling it the forgotten war, call it by its proper name, because to the veterans, Korean people, and all the survivors of the war, it is anything but forgotten.
Good job, good job, good job.